Okay, so this is actually going to be the third video this week. I'm sorry about that, but my hard drive filled up and I didn't realize it, and so I got cut off on that last one, so this will be number 3. But we're talking about blessings and cursings, and he's basically saying live in this way and you'll be blessed. And what we find as we continue in the Old Testament is God's people don't keep the covenant. God's people don't follow these laws and these callings to live in a way that is right and good and just. One other thing on the law, people say, well, why don't we, follow like the clothing laws or the food laws of the Old Testament? Why don't we still sacrifice bulls and things like this? One helpful way to think about it is this. The laws given, and there's kind of 3 kinds of laws given in the Old Testament, the Mosaic Law. You have ceremonial law, and this has to do, and then civil law, and then moral law. And ceremonial law has to do with things like what goes on in the temple, the sacrifices, cleanliness laws, not eating pork, all these kinds of ceremonial things that were important at the time, but were really pointing forward to this ultimate reality in Christ that was to come. It was teaching. And so once the reality came in Jesus, the shadows that were pointing forward to Jesus, we no longer need to do them. We can still learn from the ceremonial law. It helps us fill out our understanding of our salvation and what Christ has done, but we're not needing to do those things anymore. And then you have civil law, which had to do really with a specific time and place when there was a nation of God's people were a geopolitical nation living under God's rule and through a king in the promised land, and as Christians we're no longer in that situation, and so those kind of civil laws don't apply to us. Now there's still things we can learn from them, and many really good governments have learned from those civil laws and applied them to a lot of Western law, but it's not something Christians have to implement. We're not at all, if you read the New Testament, we're not called to have kind of a theocracy where we enforce all of these things. And then there's the moral law. And the moral law has to do with kind of how we relate to God morally, how we treat one another, and the moral law in general is brought forward, and we are still supposed to obey that, and most all of the moral law is reiterated and even heightened when you get to the New Testament. So Jesus says things like, you've read in the law of Moses that you're not supposed to commit adultery, but I say to you, even to look at a woman with lust in your heart is to commit adultery with her in your heart. And so he's saying, I'm telling you that law is good and true, and it should even filter down into the deepest parts of your being. So that's just a little bit. There's a lot more we could talk about in how to interpret the Old Testament, but that's one way that can be helpful. Things have happened since the Mosaic Law was given, specifically the coming of Christ and his accomplishment of salvation, that make it so that we don't need to continue to follow the ceremonial laws and the festivals in order to be obedient to God, because those things have been fulfilled in Jesus. And the place where one clear place where this is explained is found in Colossians, where in Colossians 2:16 it says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath," talking about kind of the ceremonial laws with food and drink, some of the ceremonial laws of like festivals and Sabbaths. It says, "These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels." So he's saying those were a shadow. They're pointing to Christ. Now Christ is here. We don't have to judge each other and obey some of those ceremonial laws. So that's just a little bit about Leviticus. Now look at Numbers. And when you get to Numbers, we get back into some pretty eventful narrative rather than just recounting of God's law. And it's a lot of stories, where in Leviticus it's a lot of laws, Numbers are a lot of amazing stories. And here's basically a summary of the story of Numbers. It's picking up with kind of what happened when God's people left Mount Sinai. And the first generation of adults who were delivered from Egypt, they failed to obey God. They failed to trust in God. They worshipped the golden calf. They were led to do that by Aaron. We learned at the end of Exodus and then also in Numbers. They grumble against Moses. In fact, Aaron and Miriam are Moses' brother and sister. And at one point, Aaron and Miriam in Numbers chapter 12 say, we don't like Moses' leadership that much. And God makes it really clear. He rebukes them. That's not okay. Moses is God's chosen leader. And that's one of the key themes of Numbers, the leader God has chosen. They commit sexual immorality, people of Israel do. They don't trust in God. They want to go back to Egypt. Whenever things get hard, they kind of start whining and complaining and say, it was better for us when we were in Egypt. I wish we were slaves in Egypt again. It's so much better than having God as our leader. And so the first generation fails and sins and is unfaithful and immoral, and they lack faith. And so God judges them. And so an outline, chapters 1 through 10, are the final preparations prior to leaving Mount Sinai. So remember, we got to Mount Sinai in Exodus 19. God gives the law in Exodus and Leviticus. And now chapters 1 through 10 is Moses preparing the people to leave Mount Sinai. Numbers 11 through 25 outline the failure of the first generation. So it's just story after story of their sin and rebellion, immorality, and death happens over and over and over again. And they don't trust God. So right when they leave Mount Sinai, so this is just weeks after they've left Egypt, God is preparing them to go into the promised land. And so Moses sends ahead a group of spies. And if you look at Numbers 13, we'll go to verse 25. Moses sends spies into the promised land to check it out, see how it is. After 40 days, they return from spying out the land. They come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness. And they brought word to them and showed them the fruit of the land. They said, we come to the land and it's flowing with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. It's huge fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And so the spies are saying, this isn't going to work. We can't do this. The people are too great for us. We won't be able to defeat them. Verse 30, Caleb is one of the spies. Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are all well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we've gone to spy out, it devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And so basically these spies don't trust in God other than Caleb. And they put fear into the hearts of the people. And rather than believe God's promise, God said, I'm going to put you into the land. God said he would do it. God already defeated the most powerful kingdom in the world. And now they're doubting God. And in chapter 14, all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. So who's their leader? God, through Moses, right? And they're saying, we reject God's leadership, and we want to have our own leader, and we want to go back to Egypt. And so God brings judgment. Okay, and Moses pleads with the people, and God says, I'm going to judge this nation. And Moses intercedes for them and says, don't wipe us out completely. And God says, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despised me shall see it, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went. So God judges them and says, all the adults who came out of Egypt are going to die. And so they wander in the wilderness for 40 years in chapters 11 through 25. And it's the second generation, those who were young children when they were delivered from Egypt, or those born in the wilderness, who God is going to deliver into the nation of Israel. And only two adults, Caleb and Joshua, who saw the Exodus and remember it as adults, are going to go into the promised land. So Joshua and Caleb are key figures. And then chapters 26 through 36 is the preparation for the second generation. Chapter 26, there's a census laying out who's there. Chapter 27, Joshua is made the new leader. And the book of Numbers teaches us about the sinfulness of the human heart. Even after the people have seen God's grace, they continue to doubt him. They continue to sin against him and reject him. The book of Numbers also teaches us about the patience of God. God is merciful. God's merciful to them. God's merciful to their children. God continues to fulfill his promises. And he does so through the leader that he has chosen. In this case, Moses and then Joshua. But ultimately, the leader that he has chosen is Jesus. Well, that's the book of Numbers. And then finally, the last book in the Pentateuch is the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Deuteronomy basically means second law. Nomos meaning law, deutero, second. So this is the second giving of the law. So if you read Exodus and Leviticus, and then you read Deuteronomy, you're like, hey, this sounds really familiar. And that's exactly what it is. Because you think about the history, all those adults are there at Mount Sinai. They received the law and the covenant. God says, hey, if you obey me, if you listen to this, then I'll bless you. But then after 40 years, the whole first generation of adults has died out. And now the second generation is getting ready to go into the promised land and be delivered. And what Moses does is, as they're getting ready to go, Moses is wanting to make sure the second generation of Israelites is ready. And so he gives a series of speeches in which he reiterates and tells them and reminds them of what the law was. So you have the preamble in chapter 1, verse 1 through 5. Then you have the historical prologue. And this is when Moses just recounts what God has done so far. And he reminds them. And in fact, Deuteronomy tells them and tells us to not forget what God has done. You need to remember all the ways God's worked in your life so that you don't end up like that first generation of Israelites and end up doubting God. And if you're a Christian, you need to remember what God's done for you and recount it. And that's why Christians take the Lord's Supper, is to remember Jesus died for us. And to remember that he promised that he's coming back, and just constantly remember what God has done. And so that's how Moses starts. He gives kind of this historical prologue. Here's what God has done. And then in chapters 4 through 26, he says, okay, here's God's covenant. Right? Here's what God's called you to do. Here's how God's called you to live with him and with each other. And he gives all these details. And then you get to the end of Deuteronomy, chapters 27 through 30, and he once again gives blessings and cursings. He says, here's the covenant. If you follow God's word and do live up to your end of the covenant, he will bless you. You will stay in the promised land. You will have security on all sides. Your crops will bear, your livestock will bear lots of animals. Your lands will bear a lot of crops, and you'll be blessed by God, and he'll use you to be a blessing to the nations. But if you disregard God and break the covenant and go after other gods, you will experience curses, meaning other nations will come and conquer you and take you from the land, and you won't have peace, and you won't be near God. So there's God's expectations, his promises, and then there's blessings and cursings. And Moses calls them to remember what God has done and to choose blessing. And then in the last few chapters are kind of succession arrangements. Here's how Joshua's going to rule, and here's what's going to happen when Moses dies. And so that's kind of the Pentateuch, or the Torah. is this, and it's called the Old Covenant because this isn't how we relate to God anymore. It's not, hey, if you do all that God says, then you'll be blessed, and if you don't, you'll be cursed, and everything will go terrible for the rest of your life. No, Jesus brings what's called a new covenant. And what Jesus did when he came is he lived a perfect life. He perfectly fulfilled God's law. He obeyed. Where Israel failed over and over again throughout the Old Testament, Jesus perfectly obeyed. And he obeyed in our place. And then he died on the cross and he took our curse. He paid for our punishment. And then he rose from the dead. So now, if you will admit that you have broken God's law, and you will trust in Jesus, he becomes your substitute. You're united to Christ, and God sees you as having fulfilled all of the obligations of the law, because Jesus perfectly obeyed him. And God sees all of your sin as taken care of and punished and forgiven because Christ died for you. And so we should be grateful that Jesus is our great covenant keeper. And when we trust in him, he comes into our lives and he enables us and helps us to live God's way and to experience God's blessing. Not perfectly, but really. And to live out the life that the Israelites couldn't live on their own. We have to do it by faith. And one day when Jesus was living and ministering, somebody came up to him and said, there's so many laws, right? So what's the greatest commandment? And what he was asking is, you read Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, there's just hundreds and hundreds of laws. Some say 490 different laws. How do I obey all that? Can you sum it up for us all in one? And Jesus did. He quoted a verse from Deuteronomy, and he said that the first and greatest commandment is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our... Oops, I'm sorry, I used the wrong... Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And so Jesus says this is the greatest commandment. It's about loving God. It's not about just doing a bunch of external things to keep God on your side. It's about loving God from the heart, with your mind, with your strength, with your soul. It's about living for God and being just so grateful for what he has done in giving you every good thing that you have and being so merciful to you. That's the summation of the law. That's the greatest commandment. And then Jesus added, the second one is like it. And then he quoted Leviticus 19. In Leviticus 19, there's all these laws. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. He's basically saying you should leave some food behind for people who are poor and need it. Verse 11, you shall not steal. Verse 13, you shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. Verse 15, you shall not do any injustice in court. But then verse 17, he says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus says this is the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second one is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is what the law is all about. Loving God, living for him, and loving people. And in the book of 1 John it says, if you really love God, then you will love people. And that's God's expectation of us. This isn't just random hoops to jump through. This is God's guidelines on how to live in a way that's blessed as we love him and love others. So that's the Pentateuch, that's the Torah, the Mosaic Law, and really foundational in understanding the entire Bible, including the New Testament and Jesus. So I hope you've watched all three of these lectures, and after this, and then doing your reading in Johnson's book and doing your Bible reading, you'll be ready to take the quiz, and I'm sure you will succeed.